Welcome to today's deep dive. Before we start, I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are trying to paint this really smooth, beautiful, flowing river.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, but your only tool is a typewriter.
Oh, wow. Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. Every time you press a key, you just get this hard, distinct mechanical click. You can't blend the ink. You can't, smudge the lines to make it look like
It's
water.
just a series of dots.
Right. And for centuries, that is exactly how the classical music world looked at the Santoor, which is this massed wooden box strung with like 100 metal strings. They basically looked at it and called it defective.
Because it was a musical typewriter in a world that wanted flowing rivers of sound.
Exactly. Today, we are taking a deep dive into this really fascinating piece of research we got from MMR Monumental Movement Records. And we are going to uncover how that exact perceived defect didn't just change music.
Yeah, it's way bigger than that.
It is. We're exploring how this one physical limitation forced a total revolution in how an instrument is played, how it's built, and ultimately how it changes the way you and I actually perceive the passage of time.
Which, I mean, it's a massive leap, right? It's suggesting a wooden box can alter human time perception.
It sounds kind of crazy.
It does. But to understand how that actually happens, you have to look really closely at the mechanical evolution of the Santoor. You have to look at its migration and, well, just the sheer acoustic physics of what happens when you strike a metal string.
Right.
Because this story, it forces a total reconsideration of what music actually is.
Yeah.
Like, we have to ask ourselves, is music the physical notes being struck, or is it, the lingering space and the silence fading between those strikes?
I love that. And I want to start by tracing the geography here. Because before the Santoor was reshaping modern electronic and ambient music, it had to actually make its way to India.
Right, it had a long journey.
Yeah, we're going way, way back to ancient Persia, like
Yeah.
well before the Common Era.
Yeah, so the Santoor belongs to this huge global family of hammered dulcimers.
Okay.
And if you've never seen one, these are instruments where multiple strings are stretched over a hollow resonating body. Usually, it's this trapezoid-shaped wooden box. And the player strikes those strings with these really small, lightweight mallets.
Like little wooden sticks.
Basically, yeah. And because the early Persian versions were relatively portable and incredibly expressive, they traveled really easily. They moved along the Central Asian trade routes,
Right.
the vast network of the Silk Road, right during the early Middle Ages.
Right.
And as the instrument passed through all these different cultures in Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, it physically evolved to meet local tastes. But the crucial destination for our deep dive today is the Kashmir region in northern India.
Which is where it firmly settled.
Exactly. Really integrated there by around the 14th century.
The thing that stood out to me in the MMR column is that when it arrived in Kashmir, it didn't end up in these grand, formal, classical concert halls.
No, not at all.
It integrated deeply into the grassroots, local culture. It was the backdrop for, wedding ceremonies, seasonal agricultural festivals, and intimate Sufi religious gatherings. It was really the voice of the everyday community.
Yeah, in those Kashmiri folk settings, the Santoor functioned almost entirely as an accompanying instrument for vocalists, which is so important because it exposes the first really unique philosophical trait of the instrument.
How so?
Well, in a folk context, the Santoor player wasn't strictly concerned with playing rigid musical scales, right, or keeping this marching metronomic rhythm. The musicians were doing something much more, organic.
Right.
They were physically striking the strings to perfectly match the breath of the singer.
Okay, see, I tried to picture this when I was reading the source. How do you actually do that with a pair of wooden sticks? Like, if a singer takes a sudden gasp or lets out this long, trembling sigh, how does hitting a piece of metal convey human breath?
It's all about the mechanics of the strike. The player manipulates the speed and the angle of the mallets to shadow the vocal inflection.
Oh.
So if the vocalist takes a long, slow breath that swells in volume, the Santoor player might start with very soft, slow strikes at a glancing angle, like just barely brushing the strings.
Just a whisper of a sound.
Right. And as the singer's voice rises, the player increases the speed of the strikes and brings the mallets down at a sharper, more direct angle. That causes the metal to ring louder and just more aggressively. It creates this huge acoustic swelling effect.
Wow.
The Santoor player isn't trying to dominate the melody at all. They are enveloping the narrative. They're basically physically mimicking the expansion and contraction of the human lungs.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because if the Santoor was this incredibly expressive, dynamic tool that could literally mirror human breathing, I am really struggling to understand why it was locked out of the high art world of Indian classical music for centuries. I mean, the classical establishment essentially wanted absolutely nothing to do with it.
Yeah, they really didn't. And that rejection comes down to a really harsh clash between the fundamental physics of the instrument and the rigid, like, non-negotiable rules of Hindustani classical music.
Okay,
So Hindustani music places its absolute highest value on something called Meend.
right, Mained.
And Meend is the seamless, continuous microtonal glide between two pitches. Elite classical instruments like the sitar or the sarod or the bansuri flute, they are celebrated specifically because they can sustain a note and slide to the next one without a single break in the sound.
You don't just jump from a C to a D.
Exactly. You physically pull the string across the fretboard so the listener hears every single microtonal frequency in between those two notes. The whole goal is to mimic the continuous flow of a vocal sigh.
But the Santoor is a hammered string instrument. You can't pull a string that you're actively hitting with a stick.
You can't. You apply kinetic energy to a string with a wooden mallet, the string rings out, and then the physics of decay immediately take over. The sustain is inherently short.
The typewriter click.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A smooth, continuous glide between notes is just mechanically impossible.
Yeah.
But because of this physical wall, the classical elite deemed the Santoor incomplete.
Wow. Incomplete.
Yeah, it was viewed as this quaint, defective folk instrument that fundamentally lacked the acoustic architecture for serious, heavy classical ragas.
So for hundreds of years, it's just stuck in this folk category because of a mechanical limitation.
Right.
But then in the 1950s, this musician named Pandit Shivkumar Sharma steps in, and he looks at this inability to sustain and glide. And he somehow turns it into an entirely new musical vocabulary. And the MMR text mentions he had to completely re-engineer the instrument to do this. What did he actually change about the physical box?
Well, the traditional Kashmiri folk Santoor was relatively limited in its range. It might have only had enough strings to play a few basic diatonic scales, but Sharma needed the instrument to handle complex, chromatic classical ragas.
Which have a ton of notes.
Right, ragas require access to a massive array of specific intervals and microtones. So he fundamentally changed the layout. He increased the number of strings, he moved the wooden bridges that hold the strings up, basically rearranging the entire geometric landscape of the instrument.
So he could reach the notes faster.
Yeah, so he could access complex harmonic intervals instantly without having to retune during a live performance, and he had to ensure the wooden body could even handle the massive physical tension of all those added metal strings without just snapping in half.
Okay, so changing the strings gives him more notes, but that still doesn't solve the core physics problem, right? He still has a stick, a string, and a rapid decay. How on earth do you fake a continuous glide when the note starts dying the literal second you hit it?
This is the genius part. He had to invent a completely new mallet technique. Sharma realized he couldn't bend the string, so he had to bend the human ear's perception of the sound.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because he hits the string so fast that the ear blends the impacts together. Wait, that sounds exactly like a visual trick, like that late 19th century painting style. Pointillism.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Right, where they don't use brush strokes, they just use thousands of tiny dots of pure color. And if you stand 2 inches away from the canvas, it looks like chaotic nonsense. But if you step back, your brain blends those individual dots into a perfectly smooth, continuous shape.
It is exactly like that. It's George Seurat with sound waves. By striking the string with a rapid, blindingly fast tremolo, the individual impacts just blur together in the listener's brain.
That is wild.
The human ear literally stops processing hit, 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 and begins to perceive one sustained, shimmering, continuous tone. Sharma's true historical achievement wasn't just modifying a wooden box. He fundamentally changed how the instrument was processed by the human auditory system.
So he used the granular percussive attack of the mallets to simulate those smooth classical glides of gamaka and mend.
Yes. He turned a severe percussion limitation into a melodic superpower.
Which finally gets the Santoor a seat at the classical table.
Exactly.
But to really wrap my head around why that specific shimmering sound works so well, we need to pop the hood and look at the anatomy of the Indian classical Santoor. Because we're talking about a heavily modified instrument that now holds roughly 100 metal strings. I mean, just the thought of tuning 100 separate strings before a performance sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Oh, it takes forever. But the tuning process is where the acoustic genius of the instrument really reveals itself, because those 100 strings do not represent 100 different musical notes.
Right, they're grouped together.
Right, they are grouped into what luthiers call courses. A course is a cluster of strings, usually 3 or 4, that are tuned to the exact same pitch and rest on the same wooden bridge. So when the player brings the mallet down on a course, they aren't striking one thick string, they are striking 3 or 4 thin strings simultaneously.
Okay, but I would think one thick string would be louder and just way easier to manage. Why go through all the trouble of clustering multiple thin strings together for a single note?
It all comes down to the complex physics of overtones. When you strike 3 identical strings at the exact same time, they do not vibrate perfectly in sync with each other.
Because you can't hit them identically.
Right, and they vibrate slightly out of phase.
Hmm.
This microscopic difference creates a natural chorusing effect. It actually thickens the sound. It creates this incredibly rich, stable, shimmering cloud of overtones that lingers in the air much, much longer than a single thick string ever could.
And according to the MMR text, the tuning itself isn't just like a chore to get the instrument in key. The tuning is deeply tied to the actual philosophy of the performance.
It is. In Indian classical music, compositions are based on ragas. And a raga is not just a scale. It is a highly specific melodic framework tied to distinct human emotions, seasons, and even specific times of day. Yeah, so a raga meant to be played at dawn has a completely different psychological and emotional character than a raga meant for midnight. The Santoor player must painstakingly retune all those courses to emphasize the tonic and dominant notes of the specific raga they are about to perform.
So they're actively like child-proofing their instrument for that specific emotional landscape. There are literally no wrong notes available to accidentally hit.
Right, everything is mathematically primed for that exact moment in time. And this brings us to a phenomenon called sympathetic resonance, which is vital to the Santoor's magic.
Okay, break that down for us.
Think of it like pushing a child on a swing. If you push the swing at the exact right moment, matching its natural rhythm, it goes higher. Sound waves work the exact same way in the air.
Okay.
When the player strikes a C note, the sound waves travel through the wooden body of the instrument and through the air itself. If there are other strings on the board tuned to C, or a harmonic of C, those resting strings will catch that wave. The air physically pushes them, and they start humming on their own without ever being touched by a mallet.
That is incredible. The instrument is essentially playing itself in the background.
It is. It creates this continuous, haunting, natural drone that grounds the entire performance. The notes you aren't playing are just as important to the atmosphere as the notes you are actively striking.
So what does this all mean for the instrument's family tree? Because if the Indian Santoor evolved to create this massive, lush, continuous river of overtones, I am really curious about its ancestors. The instrument started in Persia. Did the Santoor makers back in Iran follow this same path, or did they take the mechanics in a completely different direction?
They took a drastically different path, driven by a completely divergent regional aesthetic. The Iranian Santoor, which is usually spelled S-A-N-T-U-R, is built on an opposing philosophy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, where the Indian Santoor utilizes 100 strings and massive sympathetic resonance to create a wash of sound, the Iranian Santoor uses fewer strings, typically around 72. Its wooden body is designed differently, it's often lighter, and its bridge layout strictly organizes the range. It does not want a muddy cloud of sound. It relies on distinct crystalline note separation.
So the Iranian instrument wants you to hear the borders of every single strike.
Yes. The playing mechanics reflect this desire for absolute clarity. Iranian players strike the strings at a much steeper, near-vertical angle. When you bring the mallet straight down with that kind of precision, the physical attack on the strings is incredibly sharp, prominent, and aggressive.
Ah, I see.
The resulting note rings out cleanly and decays in a way that separates it from the next strike. The Indian Santoor player, by contrast, often strikes at a lower, more horizontal angle, purposefully trying to blend the attacks together to feed that continuous river of sound.
It's basically a structural difference in how you build a piece of music. The Iranian approach sounds very architectural, laying distinct bricks note by note to build a melody. But the Indian approach is atmospheric, focusing on the continuous flow, the decay, the water running between the bricks.
That's a great way to put it. They share the same name and the same ancient ancestry, but they exist in entirely different sonic universes.
Yeah.
And that specific Indian obsession with a continuous, ringing, atmospheric cloud of sound perfectly primed the instrument to collide with a modern 20th century technological invention.
The microphone.
Exactly.
But wait, if the Indian Santoor is creating this really delicate river of overtones, how did people actually hear the nuance of it before amplification? Like,
Yeah.
if you put a Santoor in a massive concert hall without a microphone, wouldn't the room just completely swallow all that delicate decay?
It absolutely did. The short natural decay was a massive acoustic limitation in large spaces. Unamplified, only the people sitting in the first few rows were experiencing the true depth of the sympathetic resonance and those fading overtones.
That's a shame.
It was. The room devoured the quietest, most magical parts of the instrument. But the introduction of high-fidelity recording technology and really sensitive condenser microphones in the late 20th century completely inverted this dynamic.
Because you can put the microphone inches away from the metal.
Exactly. You capture a micro-world that the human ear could never naturally access in a concert hall.
It sounds like the microphone acted as an acoustic microscope. Suddenly, you aren't just hearing a melody anymore. You are zooming in on the actual atoms of the sound. Like you're hearing the friction of the wood, the chaotic humming of the strings you didn't even hit. You can probably hear the air being physically pushed out of the way before the mallet even makes contact.
You really can. The microphone gave the Santoor this massive, larger-than-life, three-dimensional presence. And that hyper-detailed acoustic profile immediately caught the attention of musicians far outside the traditional Indian classical sphere.
Right, so moving into the modern era.
Yeah, as we moved into the 1970s and 80s, the Santoor started appearing in global fusion projects, sweeping film scores, and ensemble performances all over the world.
Because it's just deeply evocative. But it seems to have found a very specific home in ambient and minimalist music, right?
Oh, definitely. It connects perfectly with jazz, ambient, and modern electronic minimalism. Because when you analyze the structure of ambient music, it relies heavily on repetitive patterns, slow, glacial evolution, and sustained drones. The Indian Santoor is, by its very physical design, a machine engineered to create repetitive strikes, lingering overtones, and massive sympathetic drones.
It's basically the acoustic grandfather of the modern electronic synthesizer.
It really is. Contemporary players often treat it exactly like a synthesizer. They approach it not just as an instrument meant to play a distinct tune, but as a musical object.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, modern performances often begin with incredibly soft, almost imperceptible strikes. The player isn't trying to establish a rhythm or tap out a melody. They're just slowly exciting the metal strings, feeding kinetic energy into the wood, and letting the overtones melt together to form an ambient cloud.
That completely shifts the burden of how you, as a listener, experience the art. Because when you listen to a standard pop song, your brain is actively anticipating the chorus. When you listen to a classical piano concerto, you are following the melody, waiting for the resolution of the next chord. You are always living in the future of the song. But with this modern ambient application of the Santoor, there is no future to wait for. You aren't anticipating the next note. You are forced to drown in the current one.
Yeah, it pushes the human brain into a deeply nonlinear state. The Santoor ceases to be a tool that merely executes a pre-written musical structure. It transforms into a device that allows the listener to perceive the actual physical process of a structure forming in real time.
Ah.
You are just sitting there, actively listening to the physics of sound happening.
This entire journey is just a masterclass in how a perceived weakness can shatter an existing paradigm and create something entirely new. I mean, the classical world shunned the Santoor because it couldn't sustain a perfect note. It was a typewriter. But that exact physical limitation, that rapid decay of the hammered string, forced Pandit Jiv Kumar Sharma to invent the blindingly fast pointillist tremolo technique. And that technique unlocked a shimmering cloud of overtones. And that massive cloud, once captured by the microscopic lens of modern microphones, positioned this ancient wooden box as a foundational pillar of modern ambient and electronic music. The limitation wasn't a roadblock at all. It was the exact catalyst required for the innovation.
The mechanical evolution of the Santoor is a profound lesson in adaptability. And, the MMR research piece actually concludes with a line that beautifully synthesizes everything we've discussed today.
Oh, what's that?
It suggests that the Santoor, through its mechanics and its resonance, answers the question of how sound remembers time.
How sound remembers time. That is beautiful.
Yeah. It functions as a device that physically converts the past into the present. The moment the wooden mallet strikes the metal string, that initial attack is already in the past. It's gone.
Right.
But the overtone, the sympathetic resonance that hums across the other 99 strings, carries the memory of that past action forward. It melts the past into the present moment, sustaining it until it slowly and inevitably fades away into silence.
That is an incredibly striking image. And it leaves me with a final challenge for you, the listener, to mull over as you step back into your day. Because in our incredibly fast paced, hyper connected modern lives, we are almost entirely focused on where we are going next, right?
Hmm.
The next task on the list, the next email to send, the next destination.
Always the next thing.
Right. We are endlessly focused on the next strike of the mallet. But if you were to view the architecture of your own life, like the hundred strings of a Santoor, what would happen if you stopped focusing on the next strike and instead paid attention to the fade?
The lingering resonance.
Exactly. What would happen if you stopped to notice how your recent experiences, your past conversations, and the actions you took yesterday are all resonating right now? How are they sympathetically vibrating, melting together, and forming the invisible atmosphere of your present environment? Because maybe, just like the Santoor, the most beautiful and impactful part of your day isn't the loud, percussive event itself. Maybe it's the quiet, lingering space that follows. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time.